it was just overwhelming. I think the bigger factor was just overwhelming experiences of these three critical sectors in one night. And I really just broke. And I was like, I am absolutely not going to raise my kids here.
Hey, just a quick one from me before we do head over to the conversation. Firstly, thank you so much for deciding to watch the full version of this episode. As you can imagine, it takes a lot of effort by multiple people in order to get these episodes up on YouTube for you to enjoy. So all I ask is while you're watching, if you do find yourself loving the conversation or that you're taking something useful away from it, then please do hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Because that shows to me that this episode was delivering to you what you expected of it. Plus, the more subscribers, the higher the quality of the guests and the content that this show can deliver. That's it from me. Now over to the episode. Go for it. Boom. Everything's aligned. Do you know why they do that or where that's come from?
No, I don't know the story.
So the clap is to align the video and the audio. But one thing I never knew is, a clapperboard.
Oh.
Like take one.
But it's not that loud though.
I think it's probably nearer the camera.
Got it.
Or nearer the mic, sorry. But yeah, that snap, I never knew what it was for. The snap is to make sure that you can align the audio and the video afterwards. So there's another little trick for podcasting. But anyway, Damilare, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So this is exciting because we met a couple of weeks ago. And for me, in the age of everything that we have in terms of podcasts, the number of books, audio books, and the whole lot, especially if you're interested in the space of self-development, I find it's becoming increasingly difficult to find moments that make you think, wow, this guy really stands out from the crowd. And that's what I really felt from that conversation that we had. What I want to get into is exactly how you've managed to form this, the way that you go about things. But before we do, I just want to go through some of the achievements. And bear in mind, this is a short list of some of the things you've achieved, right? You worked as a manufacturing supervisor at Nestle, and you led a team of 45 people. You're also a finalist at the Startup Istanbul 2017 and a CEO of one of the top 30 startups in Demo Africa, also in 2017. To top it all off, you managed the youngest ever presidential candidate in Nigeria's democracy. And then you were the Youth Advisory Board of Oxfam Work in Progress Alliance from 2017 to 2019 and the co-founder of an e-commerce platform which generated over 4 million in revenue in 5 years and I believe supported 500,000 consumers. This is a set of achievements that someone can hear it and immediately think either this is someone who is just graced with an unrivaled amount of determination or they were lucky, or there's something about them that I could never be able to do that. But I always feel like there's something that you can take from someone's backstory that really helps to explain the influences and what's allowed them to get to this. So this is the time to find out how and why behind what got you to where you did. So I'd love you to start with your family backstory. What do you know from either the generation or the generation before of the story that led you to where you are today?
Good question. And I think first off, this is the first time I'm hearing some of this achievement. I'm like, oh, did I do that? And as I sit here and I reflect, interestingly, my parents now, they're with me currently on holidays, and I've spent a lot more time with my dad listening to some of the backstory. Like, my dad lost his mom when it was a very young age. So he's always been like he's the firstborn, always been like the responsible person. Growing up, I know that, my granddad, we lost my granddad when I was much younger, but I always knew that everyone rallied around my dad. In an African household, the firstborn is like the head of the house. So I always knew that uncles, aunts, it's sometimes, because my granddad had more than one wife. I don't even know, I think he had 3 or 4 wives. I just knew that everyone was my dad's sibling, but I never really knew who was my dad's full sibling. They were half siblings. I recently only just found out I had one sibling. I always thought he had like 3 or 4.
Right.
And saying all that, I saw my dad shoulder a huge burden of responsibility, having to attend events. Like there's always an event in the Nigerian household every other weekend. But my dad also built his career as a banker. I think if I were to reflect on those experiences or the three of them, or it will be 3 points that stand out to me. The first would be just having a high sense of responsibility. It's something I learned from my father. Either it was implied because of his position in the family, or he actually accepted that burden of responsibility. It was something I kind of learned. The second was my dad also held himself to very high levels of success requirement. He was always driven, and I learned that bit from him. The third was my dad was not entrepreneurial. I don't think I come with an entrepreneurial gene. As a matter of fact, I describe my adventure into entrepreneurship as being accidental. I was working for someone. I was pursuing a business development opportunity, and then someone just challenged me, why don't you go after it yourself? Right? That's my journey into entrepreneurship. I never knew what entrepreneurship was, because even though I take that back, because I remember that my mom has always been entrepreneurial. Right? She was a teacher, but she always had, like, same with every African household. Like I didn't think this was peculiar, but my mom always had like one other business, right? One other business. She's either selling, trading, and sometimes she would have like shops. I would man the shops. I learned very early negotiation skills where, as I reflect on this, I make this joke where we would sell a bottle of water normally as 1 naira, right? But when there are events happening around the place, my mom would just say, hey, raise the price, raise the price. It's almost like surge, what Uber calls surge now, and raise the price. And we'll be like, oh, one naira 50 kobo. So I learned some of those things. I didn't really think it was entrepreneurial, but those things stayed with me. And then this is the third point. My dad was let go when he had worked in the bank across multiple banks for about 35 odd years. But all of a sudden, I realized that my dad was retired, and I think that in itself made me not like to work in the bank. Never was going to work in the bank. Second was, it made me think about owning my own future, right? Wanting to be responsible for. It doesn't mean I'll be the wealthiest, but just knowing that I own my future, I owed my future. That was something that I learned from my dad. I think those three things would be, if I think about the biggest influences I've had in my life, it would be watching my dad and my mom and seeing some of the things they did intentionally or unconsciously, and learning from them.
It's really interesting what you mentioned there, because objectively speaking, your dad's career is one that can be held in high regard. You know, a highly successful role in a bank. It's still, even to this day, especially from Asian backgrounds, African backgrounds, if your kid goes to work in a bank, you've succeeded in parenting your child. And then on the flip side, your mum had this entrepreneurial spirit that you said. Combining the two, did you see in your youth, was it something that you saw start to develop through your schooling years, either through what you decided to do during the time where you saw these traits start to rub off on you?
Very good question. I think one thing that stood out to me was the pursuit of excellence. I always wanted it. If there was something that my father left very clear to me, very, very clearly, was integrity. He always said it, like, even though he worked in the bank and it was quite common for shady deals to be done in the bank, he always said this to me as his son. Like, integrity was like principal to him. And so that's one basic thing I learned from him. To repay him, when I went to the university, I actually committed to my father and I said I was going to finish with the first class. So when I got into uni, I had a conversation, and that's something I really appreciate my father for when I reflect on it, that it's allowed me make choices very early. So when I was going to secondary school, he said, what school do you want to go to? I mean, there are few kids like myself who had the opportunity of picking the schools, but typically it's parents saying, this is the school you're going to. But my dad said, hey, you've got all these offers. Which school do you really want to go to? And so growing up, I always learned that bit of integrity from him. Now, to the point about when I got into the uni, right, I committed to him. I was like, I was going to finish with the first class. I studied chemical engineering from University of Lagos. And I was on course, right? I had a nickname in school relating to books, and Bonde. Bonde is like an advanced mathematics books for engineering. And I was on course up until year 3, or the third year of university. And I came down with tuberculosis in the uni. And it meant that for 1 year, I was literally out of school. My 2-semester exams, I wrote them from the hospital. So I would come in, my parents would bring me in from like the hospital, bring me to school. And I remember my course advisor telling me, "Are you sure you don't want to defer?" And I'm like, "No." I had this conversation with my father. I'm not going to spend an extra year, and I'm going to finish with the first class. I think I overestimated my ability to succeed under those conditions. At the end of my third year, I realized that I wasn't going to finish with the first class. But I also realized that with minimal effort, I'll finish with the second class upper. I think that was the significant shift for me because by the end of year 3, I started picking up other interests. I started reading other books. And that was quite interesting. That was where I picked up business books. So by the beginning of year 4, going to the library was not reading chemical engineering books, it was business books. And at the end of year 4, I started putting out feelers that I could write business plans. I didn't know if I could write it. And someone said, "Oh, I know someone who's looking for someone who could write business plans." And I would negotiate, and the person offered to pay me for business plans. And I wrote the business plan. The person was like, "Wow, this is amazing. Why not come execute this business plan?" Right? And I did, because then it was relating to events and organizing events. And this person said, come lead operations. And I started to execute events that were very large scale. So while in my year 4, I was speaking to a director of marketing at Coca-Cola and selling why this event would be great. It started to convince me that, okay, maybe you know something after all. And I started to tilt more towards the business side of things. And so maybe in my year 4, as an engineer, you would do a compulsory 6 months internship, which is like in your second semester. And in my year 5, I just lost interest in school totally. I just went down the business until my course advisor told me, "The way you're going, you will not finish with this 2-1 that you are so confident you'll finish with." Then I had to just buckle up. But I think getting on that trajectory just told me that as a person, and I think this is true for many humans, we are infinite in terms of like strengths and the things we can do if we commit our hearts to it. Sometimes situations or realities can force us, but we are very infinite. The thing that was critical to me is I stopped seeing myself as a chemical engineer. Even though when I was getting to the uni, I was like, man, chemical engineering, Nigeria, oil and gas. When you're done with school, you're going to work with like Shell, you're going to work with like all the big boys. But I stopped seeing all those things. But when I was done with school, my father called me and said, "Remember some of those conversations. Now you have to go and get a job."
When you were speaking, it reminds me, I can't remember the name of the psychologist, but he's been a psychologist for a lot of the celebrities. And, if you look at the likes of Will Smith, even Eddie Hearn, these are people where a lot of the time they'll even admit that within their pursuit of everything they've achieved, alongside their dedication and hard work, a lot of the time the driving force was one of insecurity. So there's this concept of being dragged versus driven, right? And, a lot of the time we talk about these things in terms of, they were driven to achieve this, which sure plays a part of it. But a lot of the time, the thing that really keeps some people going through all the tests and the hards and the ups and downs is that they're dragged by this other force of something that's ahead of them that they feel is making them feel either insecure or that they have to live up to their expectation. Like I said, going back to Eddie Hearn, he was always in the shadow of his dad. That's a common story that you hear. They either were always trying to get the approval of their parent, or they just knew that the expectation was high. Given the generalization, but again, going back to African parenting, Asian parenting, it's very strict, and understandably so, but in a way of wanting the kids to do well. And it's something I referred to in previous episodes as this triple packaged parenting style. But especially when you mentioned the point around getting tuberculosis, and at this point, what was that force that really kept you to get through that year, or try and get through the rest of it?
I made this joke at the events, and I think there is a constant fear of poverty, right? I do not believe that I grew up poor, right? I would say that we were like lower middle class, but there was always the fear of poverty, the fear of not having stuff. It's still there. But I'm the firstborn of my father, who is the firstborn of his father, right? And if you think about like an African setting, I know the number of cousins that there's implied responsibility who are looking up to me, who I set I set the standard for. It's not uncommon for me to hear uncles and aunts say, "Oh, look at that, look at Damilare, look at that." So I don't know if that's been dragged, but it unconsciously creates the desire for me to set the pace and set the record. I think that's one part, but there's also the drive that as I've grown older, I've come into a self-realization of some of the things I really want to do, and it constantly puts me on my toes, constantly drives me. So reflecting, I would think it's a mix. The drag of poverty, if that's the word, because I realize that it's real. I know it's very real. And then the drive of wanting to be more. There's like, there's so much more I want to. I believe there's so much more I want to do in this life. Just the drive to be more. Yeah.
In 2012, you started a job in a very well-respected role in a manufacturing plant. Was that Nestle?
Yeah, that was Nestle.
Something that you said in another interview you did, you said that you became unmotivated by the routine of food manufacturing plants. You studied chemical engineering, you landed a great job, and you've spoken about the influence of looking up to your father and mother as some kind of role model because they were either high achieving or quite determined. You didn't tell your dad you'd left. What was the reaction? Or let's take it back. Can you remember what that feeling was of why you chose not to tell him?
I think it's a couple of things. So backstory before getting the Nestle job. I've gotten a few offers. I think I've also been privileged to, at most times when I'm making career decisions, school, I always had more than one offer, right? So when it came to job, I had multiple offers. And I think my parents were worried because my parents are Christians, my dad is a pastor. My parents were worried at some point that there was no spiritual stuff because there was a particular job I resumed for a week and I'm like, I'm done. I'm not going back to this job. And it was a good job, right? I won't mention the name, but it was a good job. And in that point of deciding to land at Nestle, I got bank offers. I was never going to work in the bank. So it was funny that there was one bank I was considering. And during the interview, I told the bank person that if you didn't give me a role that related to advisory, I won't take the job. Like, no, you can't take the job. You don't have experience. I'm like, well, that's me. So when they gave me the offer, as I walked out of the building, I just saw the offer letter. And so when I got home and I told my dad, I said, they didn't give me an offer. It was years later that I told him that, I got an offer, by the way, from them, but I just tore it because I was not going to take the job. If I brought the offer to you, you would have convinced me how it's the beginning, you can chat your parts, something. I just knew it was not for me. Now, to come to Nestle, when I got the Nestle offer, at that point, I thought it was a fair compromise. First, for my parents' investments, I thought it was a fair offer. I thought it was something I could see that fairly they were proud, right? Our son has finished with chemical engineering, he's working Nestle. Nestle is one of the respected employers in Nigeria. So I could see it checked quite a few boxes. I could see how many times they talked about it within their peers. And then I worked there for a few years and then I'm like, I'm done, I'm moving. I first knew, and this played out exactly the way I thought about it, I first knew that my father would flip because he would then go back to, is this the spiritual problem coming after you again? I also knew that I hadn't figured out stuff. So it's okay to want to quit, but what's your next plan? And I was still in the process of figuring out stuff. So I needed that headspace to figure out stuff. The third was, now, if you know Lagos very well, Nestle is like on the outskirts of Lagos. It's in a place called Agbara. And there were a few incidences that led me to being uncomfortable with that role, with wanting to leave. One of them was maybe my mom came to visit and I was like, wow, you live in a very nice apartment. Nice time to get married. I'm like, not married? No, wait. And so once that thing started to sip in, I'm like, yeah, this is comfort. This is not the kind of comfort I really desired. There were a few other factors. And when I was going to leave Nestle, what I did was I left with just a bag, right? I sold the entire apartment with everything in the apartment to a friend because I felt that if I started to consider, how do I let go of this? How do I let go of that? It would weigh me down. I started to think, do you really want to make a decision? Just told my friend, do you want to take everything? He said, yes, but I don't have the money. I'm like, yeah, pay over a long time. I'm fine. And I took a bag and left Agbara. And when I started to get some clarity about what next, because I had some thoughts, but I won't say that I was very clear. I thought, okay, maybe it's time to tell him. And when I told him, he did flip out. Like, what? Why did you leave? Can I appeal to my friend? Because he knew a few people that were connected to Nestle. Can we tell them you made a mistake? Can you reapply to the role again? And I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. He actually called some of his friends. I was like, he made a mistake. He did this. I'm like, do you think I'm going to go back to that? Because it wasn't a decision I arrived at. I think it was fairly quick, but it was also years of thinking about this. I still have the vivid picture of the moment I came to a conclusion about leaving Nestle. I had come out of the factory. I think I had solved a very big problem on the line. But I came out and I'm like, the plant is moving. No one thinks that I've solved a big problem on the line.
Right.
Is this what my life is going to be reduced to? And so that moment in itself, I reached it, and it was going to be difficult for anybody to convince me to walk back that decision. And so when I told him, I flipped. And every time I've made those kinds of critical decisions, I try to delay revealing to them until even when I was going to venture to being an entrepreneur. I did it a week after I got married. I never told my parents until a year after. Both my parents and my parents-in-laws, and they were angry, but we're like, yeah, this is exactly, we're trying to figure out stuff. If it didn't work, I'll have gotten another job and then told you, oh, yeah, by the way, I switched jobs. But it seemed like it was working. Now we can tell you. And that's always been my life. Like, if I want to make a decision and I think there's going to be a lot more discouragement, I'd rather delay telling those people, even if they're my parents.
That's an interesting point there, because when it comes to making those key decisions, or especially for you, what was the reaction of, especially looking at friends who may have been in a similar social circle? So you've kind of, either gone through university and got to the same sort of level or career choice. You've then decided to step away. How did they react to your decision to do that?
I have friends, but I don't have a lot of friends too. I know quite a lot of people, but I don't allow a lot of people into my really close space. So when I was going to leave that job, it was just a few people I had to tell. And some of them just told me, Dami, if you decide to fly kites, you would succeed at flying kites. So just go for it, right? And I think that's the energy that you really want, particularly as a young person trying to figure out stuff. What's really the cost of failure, right? If you don't succeed at that, you just switch and try something else. And finding pockets of those people around you who can encourage you and give you, even if they haven't got to figure out, even though in their mind they're like, if it doesn't work out, but if they give you that energy, right, to want to venture out, I think that's critical. And I think I was fortunate to have had that. I think every part of my journey, I've loved every part of it. The part from even not doing well, not getting a first class in school. I think I've loved that part because it's kind of shaped my direction. And sometimes it leaves me with this decision, with this thinking about free will and determinism. And I think that's a totally different subject, but I love every part of my journey.
It's amazing because there's this term which I'm going to call the lonely period, the lonely transition period. And this is, similar to what you've done, especially when someone has gone through their life in a path which, like you said, expressed that you started feeling uncomfortable in. A lot of people tend to stay in that comfort lane because maybe they don't have the same drive to figure out how to come out of that discomfort. But on the process of transitioning, similar to like you did, from your chemical career into whatever you're looking for next, that journey where you're making that change, that's what I call this lonely transition period, because this is a time when your behaviors and your habits start to switch away from the ones that you would usually do with your social circle or your family. Prime example, say there's someone who plays rugby and they've decided that they still love their rugby, but they want to start using their spare time for something where it's a personal development, a self-development, or to use that time somewhere else where they decide they're not going to go drinking with their friends anymore. All of a sudden, that can lead them to start to get ostracized by those exact friends, because even though he may still be doing that same core activity, you're no longer drinking with us. And that sort of ostracization, as I call it, or that sort of push away, or even like internal subconscious hatred, can come from either because they now start to see you as being too good for them because you're doing stuff that's different, so you think you're better than us. Or it comes from a place of, I start to develop some internal envy towards you because you're now doing a thing that I am not brave enough or capable enough to do myself. So the best thing is to push that back on you. Did you ever face, or could you ever remember facing any moments like this? And if not, what advice would you give to people who might fear this lonely transition period, who may look up to you in wanting to follow in something that you've done yourself?
I wish I had like a silver bullet advice. But if I reflect on my journey, I faced this more when I transitioned from being a career person to being an entrepreneur. And if I were to think about like the success, I'll credit it to my wife, my partner, because I found someone I could talk to. I'll give simple examples. So before I made a transition to being an entrepreneur, I used to work in advertising. And one of the things about working in advertising is that the hours are not often defined. Sometimes you're working on a weekend, sometimes you're working at 1 a.m., right? I think I was building skin for the next part of my journey. So the transition wasn't as swift, but something that stood out to me is actually how to have fun. And I was having this conversation with my wife very early on because I didn't realize it. I play a lot of snooker, pool, whatever you call it in the country you're listening from. And I find it allows me to distress a lot. But I could be playing pool on a Monday evening. Now, if you're a career person, that's not what you're doing. If you love pool, you probably are playing on a Friday evening, right? But on a Friday evening, I could be working, right? Or I could be figuring out like the next deal. And so I think that point of finding an outlet for me was the place where I struggled the most, right? So my first venture, I had employees, but it's great. You can hang out with your team members, but it's different. Like you can hang out with like your peers, and then you're calling your peers who have had like a tough Monday at management meeting where they've been bashed to come play pool with you on a Monday evening. It's just, and then you start to discover that many times I actually play pool with myself. Like I go to the lounge and I play pool with myself, and I started to find some of those comforts. I enjoy playing pool with myself. I imagine I'm two people I play against myself. I think that particular experience is something that I realized that I had to then figure out like other networks I could tap into, which is why I'm very big on networking, because you would have friends and sometimes you would trade up or trade down friends. But I think if anyone is thinking about this transition, my own recommendation would be quickly finding networks of people that have either made similar transitions or currently making that transition, because the lifestyle changes would be similar and that journey would be much more encouraging. I think to the point about being very lonely, if you can't change the world without being lonely, right? So I think you should also get comfortable. I'm very comfortable with being lonely. You need to get comfortable in thinking a lot of things in your head and playing video games. I play a lot of, I don't play anymore. I play video games a lot, and when I'm playing video games, I'm actually thinking a lot. But yeah, get comfortable with being lonely. I guess that would be my own one advice. I don't know if it's right or wrong.
No, I love that. And I think there's something key in what you've said, which is even in that time where you're starting to feel that loneliness, if you can involve yourself in activity that's still contributing to where you're trying to get to. So like you said, even within the video game playing, it's giving you time to figure out, or it's conducive to helping you figure out how is that getting me to that place I'm trying to transition to. But this point around networking, would you say to start that before you've begun the transition? So kind of as soon as your mind has told you that, okay, I know I want to switch out, then start networking there to form that new network of people, almost with the assumption that you are going to end up shedding some people along the way to you moving to that next course.
Absolutely. I'm convinced that the biggest influence on humans is role models. And transitions are much easier when you start to find role models who've done similar transitions. Before Usain Bolt broke the record, it just seemed like impossible for us to do as humans. And then now we've got everyone running sub 10, right? So once you find people who've gone on similar journeys, I think it demystifies, like, I give an example, like dealing with loss. I've lost huge sums of money in my life, right? So when I hear people come to me and say they've lost, I'm like, calm down. Like, how much have you lost? But what got me to that place is when I lost that amount of money, I was really scared. I was worried. Then I went to meet someone who was like, what are you talking about? You're talking about little money in the amount of money I've lost. That in itself just demystified the experience for me, and it didn't take it away, but it made me realize that, okay, there is a next step. There is a tomorrow. You're not dying. Right? Even if it feels like you are suffocating right now, but you're not going to die, right? I think the power of finding people that have either made the transitions or are making the transition just demystifies the process very quickly. Like, you're not you're not inventing rocket. You're not inventing rockets anymore. Like everyone has. You were president of like a Fortune 500. There are founders who have also been the same. Yeah, I give an example of myself. When I made a transition from manufacturing to marketing, I had no marketing degree, right? No marketing experience. I just knew that I had, and this is an unfair advantage I think about engineers. I think engineers have unfair advantages. But I just knew that I had a sense of technical side, maybe not coding, but technical like engineering. And I knew I could translate some of those skills. So it was simple examples of when I had conversations with my would-be employer, it would ask me some questions, and the way I would analyze, I would be like, it's not a marketing thing, it's just logic and analysis. It was like, that was what really impressed him. And then I also had very strong belief in the universe. So I remember one question I was asked during my interview was, well, what's your plan A? What's your plan A? I'm like, this is my plan A to get into market. What's your plan B? I'm like, this is my plan B. I was like, what's your plan C? I'm like, this is my plan C. I was like, what if it doesn't work? I'm like, I don't believe the universe works that way. If you want something, the universe aligns with you getting that stuff, right? And it was quite, I didn't think about it too much, but it was profound for him that I'm like, if I want to be a marketer, why can't I just be a marketer? Like, you probably have a degree, but I probably will figure this out in a few months, all right? And so back to your point about transition, the best way to handle transitions, look for role models. They work every time.
There's some really interesting points in there. One I want to pick up on first. So you talked about your plan A, plan B, plan C, and our plan B and C are your plan A. In other words, you didn't see failure as an option. And one other thing, like going back to the thing I said right at the beginning, where you are someone where when I heard you speak for the first time, I thought, wow, this is someone who's saying stuff that for me separates himself from the pack. And one of the things you said when you were asked at that event, what drives you to not give up? And you said, one of the things you said is, being a black role model is already one thing to drive me, but being an immigrant black model gives you another, almost what you're reframing as an unfair advantage that drives you. It could push some people away. That's a definite case of fight or flight. But in your case, that for you presents a fight that I'm representing a lot of inspiration for people who are more than capable of doing the same thing. That belief system of failure is not an option. Do you see in your previous generations where that influence might have also trickled down through the way that they were?
That's a really good question. If I think about generations, I wouldn't say I know as much to be able to form a position, but I would say that I don't want to credit too many things to my father, but again, I have to credit a lot of things to him. I see he didn't succeed at everything, but I could see an innate drive to want to succeed. And that for me was critical, like the drive to want to succeed and the outcomes might not be correlated, right? Sometimes we try to correlate too much, like drive and results. Yeah, it's great. A capitalist world wants that, but the drive first was something I learned significantly from him. And in Nigerian, right? And I use this joke, and I wish this wasn't recorded, but I use this joke. I say that Nigerians were not fully colonized, right? Because there is an unimaginable level of belief that Nigerians have, right? That sometimes can border on overconfidence, right? So when we get into rooms, I don't know if any other person has this, but when we get into rooms, we almost want to own the room. We almost want to own the space. I think that's something innately Nigerian, and I find it. I've been around the continent, very well traveled around the continent, and I can almost sense when I get into places, I'm like, there isn't a Nigerian in this room. I don't know if there's research that's something, but I see it clearly even when you party, right? When a Nigerian enters a nightclub, it's kind of different. You just want to dominate, just want to...
Right.
Yeah, so if I were to extract anything from that, I find that sense of wanting to succeed coming from that sense of wanting to own the room, wanting to dominate. But I no apologies about that, about being a Nigerian. I think it flows from that. And back to my generation, I don't know as much about them, but from my father, I really learned determinism and wanting to really succeed.
Now let's get on to your move to the UK. So you went through a series of quite pivotal moments in successive order, which you talk about that ultimately led you to make that decision, like now is the time to move. When these series of events happen, and you even say that you hadn't previously really thought about doing such a move, following that, was there a switch that went off and you knew that this was time, or were there still any sort of resistance factors, either internally or externally in terms of the people around you, that were pushing back against you being able to make that decision?
The biggest switch was the car crash, right? And the incidences that followed after. But the reason why I know that was the biggest switch is that when I told a lot of people, friends, they never saw it coming. They were like, you? Like, you? But the car crash was an unfortunate incident that kind of exposed me to 3 things in one night. And it's funny how humans get over the gulf of, or the chasm of making decisions. And that experience itself, even though it seemed like, well, you could have lived with it, you could have, if I think about, like, if I were to weight all the 3 factors, I would say that was responsible for like 60%. Now, for context, what was the car accident? I had a car accident, and then we had to use the health infrastructure in Lagos. And for the first time, I was confronted with realities of public health in Nigeria. I had been confronted, but facing it head on, it was a different reality for me. The second was I was confronted with security, Nigerian police. There's been improvements right now. I don't take that away. But in that night, I was shocked. I think shock was the bigger factor. And then the third was power. Power is a challenge in Nigeria, or electricity is a challenge in Nigeria. But having experienced those 2 things in the same night, it was just overwhelming. I think the bigger factor was just overwhelming experiences of these 3 critical sectors in one night. And I really just broke. And I was like, I am absolutely not going to raise my kids here. When I knew I was going to be a dad, I was starting to think about it, but it never really crystallized. But the moment that car crash happened, I knew that, yeah, every other thing, I was over the line. It was so funny that we only could give my parents, I think, a week and a half notice, right, that we're moving our lives, right? It was shocking for them, because we just had to call them. Like, everything is moving too fast. I just had to tell them, please come. We've got news for you. We are leaving the country in like 10 days. They're like, what? How long have you been thinking about it? We're thinking about it like 2 months ago, right? That's how quickly things moved. And yeah, that's, so I didn't think that there was enough time to experience pushbacks. Maybe if he had a longer gestation period, maybe I would have started second guessing my thoughts on my decision. But I didn't think there was enough time. Mm-hmm. Most people didn't even realize, like, most people knew in that 10-day window between when we were, yeah, so I didn't face as much pushbacks as maybe some other people would have.
It's good advice if anyone's looking to make drastic moves abroad. Minimize the gap between decision and execution.
I think it's also even how I think about many decisions too, right? Minimize the time between when you take a decision and when, like, it's also the same thing I apply even in startups, right? Make a decision, learn from it very quickly, and move on, right? No time to start dwelling on, like, just move on. Like, they're going to make 500 million decisions. I'm exaggerating, but you're going to make like a ton of more decisions in your life. So make the decision, quickly learn from it, and move on. Yeah, that's my own principle.
It's a really good point. That reminded me of so Jeff Bezos, when he wrote one of his shareholder letters, I think
the famous one.
Yeah, right, back in, was it 97?
Yeah.
And he talked about type 1 and type 2 decisions, right? Type 1 decisions are ones that can be reversed. Type 2 decisions are the ones where if you take it, you actually can't reverse it. And the thing that stops most businesses from really taking up to that next platform is exactly this, where they treat a lot of those type 1 decisions as type 2, where they think that a reversible decision is irreversible. And then that period between executing it is, insanely costly for that next stage of growth. So, it's amazing to hear this kind of in practice, not in terms of business, but also in terms of those personal decisions that you made that have ultimately led you to where you did. What was it like for you when you first moved to the UK?
Interestingly, the longest time I had ever stayed in London on visits was maybe 10 days, right? Because I just found the UK to be very boring in my travels. But I knew that it was also conducive for family, right? So those things were ringing in my head when I first moved. But I had a principle, and I've spoken about this at different fora, which is that if you are going to get into an ecosystem, try to quickly figure out how the systems work. And first, I knew I wasn't coming for school. I knew, therefore, that I needed to double the hustle for building networks here. So what I prioritized was how quickly I could build, or how quickly I could build interactions with people. So those first 4 months, figuring out like networks, becoming a dad for the first time in a new country, and then fundraising, it was quite intense. But I find that everything has paid off technically, because if I think about networks, I can say that within like UK tech scene, I'm probably 1 degree away from almost everyone, right? And I don't take that for granted, because I find that a lot of, and this is to your point about being an immigrant Black founder, I find that a lot of immigrant Black technical people or people in tech often come to me for access to other people. Because even if I don't know, I probably know someone who knows that person. Like it's very rare for me not to know that person or know someone who knows that person now. And I find that's come from the efforts I put in my first 1 year. But that was my first experience. Absolutely no regrets since I made my first move. I make this joke that when I first moved to the UK, my wife wanted a very peaceful and quiet place. If you've ever been in Lagos is like, you don't go to the noise comes to you, right? So you can just open your window and someone is shouting. Like I derived energy from that, because that energy is like, yeah, it's almost like coming to America, like, good morning, my people. Like you feel that energy in your vibe, but then when you come, like nobody's talking, everyone is silent. So I told my wife, we can't go and stay in a very reserved place. I need somewhere where I open my window, I see a lot of people. It's the reverse now, because now I'm very comfortable with the peace, with the quiet. I actually crave the greens. I crave the lake. There's just a lake right around the house. I do the walks around that. I derive energy from the peace and quiet of nature now. And I find that transition has been very interesting. Like my wife still grumbles sometimes, like she wants energy. I'm like, no, I'm raising kids. But that's been a switch for me.
Just jumping back one bit, you found, when you were mentioning that you found your co-founder in while you're still in Nigeria. This is also the time that you were applying for the Tech Nation visa. You applied once and the visa application failed the first time. And you said that the first time I read the visa guide, I had a sincere feeling of inadequacy over me. This feeling of inadequacy and then coming to you deciding to make the application and it coming through as a rejection. So Nir Ayal makes this point in his book, Indistractable, about how the way we are designed is to avoid any form of psychological discomfort, because ultimately psychological comfort leads to physiological discomfort, which causes stress and disease and illness. Every time you go through a feeling of rejection, that leads to a certain level of psychological discomfort. And then what separates the people who then decide to go again at the risk of rejection is this idea of resistance tolerance. And, naturally some people will have a higher resistance tolerance than others. It's the same way that some people have a higher pain threshold. But I think more than that, there's something else within people that will then drive them to think, I'm ready to bear that psychological or physiological pain again, because there's a vision or a purpose that I see is worth me going through that again. So you applied a second time and that's what allowed you to get it. What really was it for you that, having that initial feeling of inadequacy, overcoming that and then going for that first application and facing the rejection to think, I'm going to go again?
I think because prior to that point, I had some fair media exposure back in Nigeria. So I was like, if you Google my name, you should know that I am what I am. So even I acknowledge that the application I put in was underwhelming. Because when I contrast the first application and the second application, in the second application, I'm like, yeah, that's me. I did that stuff, right? But in the first one, I'm like, yeah, go Google me. You'll figure me out. The moment I got the feedback on the first application, I kind of knew what I did wrong. I was pissed off because it's funny. So the process for applying for the visa itself, or the endorsement as it's called, is after you apply, if you get rejected, you can apply for review. I was so pissed off, like, what do you mean? Why would you reject me? I responded in like 45 minutes. Now, my friend, they said, you shouldn't have responded. You should have taken like you had up to 28 days to respond. But I responded in 45 minutes, like, why did you guys reject me? And then they rejected me 2 days later again and said, no, we still stand by the decision. So I then took a break. I now went back and then I read the guideline. I'm like, yeah, the burden of proof is actually on me. And so I overwhelmed them and I got my endorsement in 24 hours because I submitted like yesterday and the next day I said, oh, you've been endorsed. I'm like, and at that time, people were like, yeah, you're one of the fastest endorsements they've seen.
Wow.
So to your particular point about pain or defeat, what I've learned, and again, I'm still learning, is I've defined thresholds about how I deal with failure. So you, as a founder, or if you're going to do great things in life, you're going to have to get a lot of no's, right? So I've set certain thresholds. I live by some conscious principles. So I think when we met, I talked about the principle of 13. I also have a principle of 5 minutes. I don't mourn over anything more than 5 minutes. Well, I refer, except maybe it's when I'm fighting with my wife or when, it can last more than 5 minutes. But when it comes to rejections, I look at the rejection and I try to reflect. What could I have done? Even there are some that I mourn over more than 5 minutes because when I think about the scale of the opportunity, I'm like, that should have been bigger. But I've set the principle of 5 minutes. When it's getting more than 5 minutes and I think I'm not getting over it, I just go to sleep, right? Sleep's also thing. Because when you wake up, you're like, well, yeah, there's something.
New day.
Yeah, you know. So I've defined that. It allows me to go, and that's the life of a founder. If you see any founder, the life of a founder is the ability to go from no to no till you get a yes. Like your day can be, it's almost like we are drug addicts. We get away with the highs are very few, right? So it's okay to go through the many lows just to get one high, wow, and then you go back to the lows and so it's I think all founders are some addicts of some sort.
I've never heard the comparison to that startup life being the many lows that you'll face to get that really good high from a drug addiction, but the drug then wears off. I guess the hope here is that the startup at least stays on that high, and then you get a few more no's before you jump to the next high. But hey, not speaking as any kind of expert there. So now, touching on ultimately why I met you in the first place was because you were speaking about the venture that you're currently working on, which is FoodLama, which I think is a excellent proposition. I'll put the description in the show notes for people to check it out. But, ultimately, and, add anything if I'm wrong, it's a browser extension that allows you to set your allergens and other dietary preferences. And then based off that, it will allow you to shop and include all of those factors within your shopping. So give you the right recommendations to include those allergens. Excellent, because I have allergens myself. I know your co-founder does as well. Lactose is a big issue for me. I've even learned recently that so is uncooked chickpeas, which are great, but I just cannot handle it. So it's an amazing thing that you are creating. One of the things that you frequently mention when you talk about the vision and mission of it is the integrity that you're trying to create behind it across the chain, right? Because either it's the case that there's a lack of allergen shown, or where it says may contain, but then it's still putting it as free of that, these things. So integrity comes up a lot. This idea of integrity, I draw this comparison to the workplace culture that people set up. How important is integrity in the workplace culture itself for you?
Yeah, so just to add on, because my co-founders will absolutely murder me if I don't do this. The premise of FoodLama is a digital assistant to help personalize food shopping to every lifestyle. We've only just started out as a browser extension focused on spectrum of allergies, intolerances, and lifestyle choices. But the big picture is much broader for us. We really want to be the enabler of better food choices for people, because we are convinced that as technology increasingly gets sophisticated, a lot of people are going to outsource different parts of their lives to technology making decisions for them. But that's FoodLama. In terms of integrity in the workplace, I think that's critical. But as a leader, there's first integrity you need to have as a leader. And the integrity doesn't necessarily come, because people often confuse integrity from, I don't do this, I don't do that. I think integrity as a leader I think there's some parts of integrity that relates with empathy, meaning that you are not just saying, let's get this stuff done. You've somehow, either by lived experiences or by acquired knowledge, you've lived that reality, and therefore you can empathize with, like, if someone tells me it's going to take 3 days to get X, Y, Z, I'm like, no, there's there are shorter means to getting this done because I know this. So that as a leader, for me, integrity is being able to do more than what you say you can achieve for the team, and it sets the pace. But I also think that there's integrity that you have to every other type of stakeholder, whether it's integrity to your investors, integrity to your co-founders, integrity to other people within, like your customers, your clients. There's that, and the way I really think of integrity is saying something and overachieving what you say, right? I'm very cautious of sometimes I do say things that I don't ever eventually achieve, and sometimes I'll come back to you and say, well, I planned this, it didn't really work out this way. But integrity for me is intentionally setting the bar a bit lower than what you can actually achieve and communicating that lower bar, but then surpassing it. That for me is how I think of integrity.
No, I love that. And I'm so glad that you tied it back into leadership. And just to kind of round off this whole conversation and almost bring it back to the beginning, in you mentioning leadership, the first person I think of is Simon Sinek, in terms of, a lot of his books start with Why Leaders Eat Last. It's very heavily focused on what makes a good leader. And when you talk about it in terms of the business, it's this idea of one of the key things that makes a good leader, as you're talking about, is also, are you able to create longevity in your business? So beyond the time that you're gone, what makes a really good leader is that the people below him have the command and control to be able to, solve the issues and develop the product of the business itself. Also within that, it's the idea that when you leave, the culture that you've created gets embedded in the people rather than the people then creating the new culture, right? That's the signs that you didn't set good foundation. Tying that all back in, and like I said, rounding this whole thing off together, what have you learned from your own upbringing or from the values of your previous generations that you now really look to embed into either FoodLama or any business or any venture that you do in the future?
The first, I would say, when I think about my generation, the first I think about is I'm an African, unapologetic African. And I think about my generation as being that broad African. So Nigerian, I'm first an African, then I'm Black, then I'm Nigerian, then I'm Yoruba. So when I think about my generation, I think about the generation of Africans. And I think the biggest thing that I really want to impact is just working out at something and excelling at it, right? We live in a generation where everyone wants to work on something like every 1 year, right? You want to move to the next thing. That's I don't have any moral opinions on that, but what I really want to impact is even if you don't have all the clarity about something, if you work hard at it long enough, some clarity starts to come to you and you can really excel at it. I see that repeatedly when I look across the continent and think of some of the historical achievements of my people as Africans. And that for me is what I really want to instill. I'm tired of the tropes and the stereotypes about this. I really want it to be that a Black person can lead a business and can grow the business to significant numbers. And an immigrant Black founder can really thrive in an ecosystem. I won't be the first, but I think what I've come to recognize is that as role models, if we continue to multiply ourselves as role models, right? So I make this reference where I think about how many Black-led businesses have IPO'd or have had significant exits, how many Black female founders have raised like a Series B. When I start to think about those numbers, for me, I want those numbers to really increase, right? I personally would imagine that in the future it would no longer be out of place to say this significant business is led by an African-born immigrant, a Nigerian-born immigrant. That for me is like the hallmark of what success would look like or what I really want to replicate. And in my team, we're very diverse. I've got two co-founders. One is British, one is Syrian British. I've got a team of Indonesian, Nigerians, so we're a very diverse team. I think if I, as a Black immigrant founder, set that pace of excellence and achievement, it also inspires in them about what is possible and the scale of wherever they go to. So it doesn't have to be the UK, wherever to go to. They also realize that everything is possible and you can achieve excellence as much as you want to. And that for me would be like, yeah, if you define success, however you define success, whether it's IPO, an acquisition, employing 500,000 people, yeah, that for me would be like a big mark.
Well, yeah. And I think, look, even going back to what I said at the start of everything that you've achieved and, hearing the way you gain perspective on the things that you've done. We didn't even touch on some of the things around, the unfair advantages that you mentioned, things which, a lot of people would see them as disadvantages, but it's all about reframing in the context that can, put you in a position where you're able to excel where others maybe haven't been able to do so. So, thank you so much for sharing that. And just before we finish, I like to have one final bonus question, and
I feel this is a trick question.
Unfortunately not actually.
Okay.
I have a list of questions that have been provided by previous guests, and I choose.
Please don't ask me about my favorite football club. I'm ashamed of them right now.
Oh, I'll ask you that offline. I'll ask you that. Okay. I'll ask you that offline. But if any of the listeners are interested in knowing, then just DM me, and I'll let you know. But yeah, the bonus question for you is. If you could write down one thing on a piece of paper that your daughter would open once you've gone and, refer to that as the one message that you pass down to her, what would you write?
Yeah. There's so many things I would write. I was inspired by something that Mark Zuckerberg did. I don't know if you ever saw that. His letter to his daughter it's that in itself had actually framed my mind if I were to go write like a letter to my daughter. So one thing seems unfair. So let me think about the number of things I would say and then let me think about the biggest thing. Stay different. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. Stay different. I look at my daughter now and sometimes I see her quirkiness. I see her working on her tiptoes. And I just want, the world is already too filled with too many copycats. So just stay different. Be unapologetic about being different. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. Damilare, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing everything that you did.
Thank you.
I look forward to the next chapter of FoodLama. Like I said, I'm someone who would be your target customer with the intolerances that I have. I've already installed the extension and I look forward to using it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Ooh, that was good. I enjoyed doing it.